Hello, and welcome to the Waves webinar series. Today we're going to be talking about producing indie bands on a budget, presented by producer, mixer, and engineer Peter Denenberg. But before we get started, I'm going to take a minute and go through the format of the webinar for anybody that hasn't done one of these before. My name is Yoni, and I'm the moderator. You can't see me, but I'm here working behind the scenes to help make sure everything runs smoothly. The webinar will last about an hour and has two parts to it. The first half will be a presentation from Peter, where he'll walk us through a session and show us how to achieve the best possible results under less than optimal conditions using some of his favorite Waves plugins in the process. The second half of the webinar will be an open Q&A. Feel free to submit any questions you have, and based on how much time there is, we'll try and answer as many of them as we can get to. You can send your questions in at any time, but you won't see them right away in the chat, as they'll first go to me, and then I'll feed them to Peter one at a time. Keep in mind that there are a lot of people online with us today, so we thank you for your patience while you wait to have your questions answered. I'm going to hand things over now to our presenter for today's webinar. As an engineer and mixer, he's worked on tracks for artists from every corner of contemporary music, including Queen, Mick Ronson and David Bowie, Chrissie Hynde, John Mellencamp, Joan Osborne, Cyndi Lauper, and the list goes on and on. His work as a producer and engineer led him to further success with the Spin Doctors, Deep Purple, Martin Sexton, Evan and Jaron, and again, the list goes on. He's been a Waves user for many years and was involved with the development of Waves GTR along with Paul Reed-Smith. We're very excited he could be with us here today, so please welcome Peter Denenberg.
Hi everyone, welcome to a Waves webinar. My name is Peter Denenberg. I am a veteran producer, engineer, and studio owner from New York. We're coming to you this afternoon from Acme Studios in Mamaroneck, New York, where we're celebrating our 32nd year of being in business. It's my pleasure to work on this webinar series with Waves. When we started this place, there wasn't a single piece of digital gear in sight. And obviously now, 32 years later, we're basically working with pictures of the analog gear that we started out with 32 years ago. And so much of what we rely on day to day is pictures of analog gear that Waves provides us with, whether it be the models of SSL consoles or other sort of vintage equipment, and then the newfangled, fancier things that we didn't have in the analog domain, like linear phase equalizers and multiband EQ. It's just part of our day-to-day work. As a producer and an engineer and studio owner, my first really lucky break came as a co-producer on the Spin Doctors' Pocketful of Kryptonite record. We just celebrated the 20th anniversary of that album with worldwide sales of 10 million and sales in this country of 5 million. Which was really cool. I wish we were making records now that sold that many. That spurred the sort of professional end of my career, and I've been lucky enough to work with so many great artists around this area and around the world. More recently, I've done a lot of work with Roger Glover from Deep Purple. Now that my son is grown up, I'm actually co-producing a lot of projects with my son Elliot. He, in fact, played guitar and drums on a tune on one of Roger's new records. So I also do a lot of live broadcast sound right out of Acme Studios here. In fact, we did a webinar a year or so ago about mixing live broadcast sound in Pro Tools. I produce for 1071 The Peak, a radio station here in New York, a live in the studio performance series, and we've had everyone from Rob Thomas to KT Tunstall, The Fray, OAR, the Wallflowers. We've done 70 plus of these. So this room that I'm sitting in is Studio A at Acme. The corduroy on the walls behind me is from the very beginning of when we first opened the studio. I'm afraid to take it off the walls because I'm afraid the sound will change. I won't know what I'm doing. But needless to say, when we started this place, professional recording studios is where you had to go to make a professional recording. And I don't need to tell you this, those of you who are joining us on the internet, that the world is a different place now. We can actually get professional recordings and professional results on a laptop computer. To me, This doesn't upset me. I'm not one of these old guys who wishes that the old way went away. I really enjoy the new way of doing things and the fact that we can instantly distribute our music around the whole world. And something that I've come to do in recent years is teach young people recording techniques and how to work in the box and get the same results that we used to get out of the box. I'm the chair of the studio production department at Purchase College, which is about 15 minutes from here. We have 7, 8 studios over there. One of my students, Joe, is over here manning the phones with Waves. And I really enjoy sharing what I've learned over the years with them. So the fact is that this laptop computer that I'm talking about, this small studio, basically for about the cost of a weekend or two in a professional recording studio, we can go to the music store and buy enough gear to actually put together an entire recording studio to record our own project. Only difference is that that gear does not necessarily come with the knowledge to get the kind of results that we might want to get. A lot of people ask me, and in fact, this semester at school, we did something called a mic preamp challenge. They asked, well, what really expensive mic preamp do I need to buy? Or what really expensive microphone do I need to buy to get professional results? The fact is that at this point in time, the inexpensive gear sounds quite good. It doesn't necessarily have like a magic vibe to it like a awesome vintage piece of gear would have, but a medium-priced microphone into a garden variety microphone preamp and A to D converter can sound just great. It's more about the sort of brains and the talent behind the music. And sometimes we work on projects where there's a little bit more on the brain side than there is talent, and sometimes there's a little bit more on the talent side than there is brains. But that's a topic for another webinar, I suppose. So the topic of today's webinar is producing indie bands on a budget. For a singer-songwriter, the equipment needs are quite easy, right? They're usually recording one thing at a time. Perhaps they're using loops, perhaps they're using something like GarageBand or Logic or Pro Tools, whatever. But they're recording just themselves or themselves and a guitar. It's just 2 inputs. For a band, it gets a little bit trickier. That's when you need multiple microphones. You need to be miking up drum kits. You need to be miking up guitar amps and so on and so forth. I wanted to talk about that in this webinar. My son and I, the day before yesterday, recorded a song which is going to demonstrate all of the various methods that I explained today. For argument's sake, we're going to say that we have 8 inputs and 8 outputs. I think that's definitely what comes with a lot of hardware today. Certainly like the old DigiDesign 002 or 003 had 8 inputs and 8 outputs. So we've limited the microphone selection and the amount of inputs to 8. Something that I think a lot of people neglect when they're setting up to do a recording themselves is how they actually hear what they're playing, the cue systems, the headphone systems. I do not miss the old days when everyone used to have to share one mix and there was a battle about, could I have a little bit more bass? Could I have a little bit more guitar? Could I have a little bit more bass drum? And basically you would keep turning everything up and up and up and up and up until you ran out of faders. You'd have to like make a slot in the console so you could push the fader further. So a bunch of years ago, they started coming out with these little fancy, very expensive private cue headphone systems. And that really took the pressure off in terms of making all the different musicians on a project happy. I left it in the trunk of my car and forgot to bring it in. But the fact is that you can go to the music store and get like a $35 Behringer mixer, which has like 2 stereo ins and 1 mono in. And you could use that for a little headphone mixer. So you can send the drum mix, say, out outputs 3 and 4 of your workstation, and then the click out output 8, and patch them into one of these little $35 boxes and stick it by the drummer, and then he can have as much click as he needs without the guitar player having to have his head taken off with that much click. There are some very reasonably priced systems made by Furman, which actually you can set up, which will let everyone have their own headphone mix. I think one of the most important things not to overlook when setting up for a session is these cue systems, these cue stations. A lot of professional bands, a lot of big acts actually record in semi-pro or sort of home situations. We just did one of those programs I was talking about earlier with Feist, and they were talking about how they had just set up in a barn where it was a very, very comfortable vibe, and they much preferred that to working in a sort of sterile, like old-fashioned recording studio. So let me talk about what we did for this song, and then I'll play you the song, and I'll get more into it from there. Limiting ourselves to 8 inputs and to cheap microphones. I'm going to switch to the screen now. We set up the drums, for starters, with a Recorderman setup. What is a Recorderman setup? If you do a search on YouTube, you can find a nice video of how to do it. You can see here these 2 microphones set up on top of the drums. They're 414s. Now, if all you have are 2 inputs, you can actually get a whole drum sound with this mic technique. That's 2 414s on top of the drums. They're not randomly placed, though. We measure their placement by using a string, which you can see here, pinned down by the bass drum beater, and also pinned down the other part of the string by the thumb of the drummer on the snare drum. That's my son Elliot playing drums. And so what we're doing is we're measuring the distance at the same time from the bass drum beater and the snare drum to that first AKG 414 microphone. That's a cardioid condenser mic. And then, keeping the string tight, we measure the distance to the microphone that's sort of over his right-hand shoulder. And if one microphone is a little further or a little closer, we move it. And the point of this is to keep those microphones the exact same distance so there's no phase issues from both the bass drum and the snare drum. If all we have are 2 channels, we can actually get in a whole drum sound like this. It's really quite amazing. Sometimes you add a little bit of low end on an EQ, but it works. So I added a couple of mics to this because we had 8 inputs. My make-believe band was just drums, bass, guitar, and a vocalist. So I had 5 microphones that I could use for drums. And then number 6 was a bass, number 7 was a guitar, number 8 was a vocal. So I added a kick drum mic, and again, promising to keep things cheap. That's a Shure SM57 in the kick drum. On the snare drum, also a Shure SM57. As Joe Yonkers, who's helping me out today, pointed out, we have very funny moon gel, which came from Walmart in sheets. It's actually like kids' toy gel from Walmart or something, and you can get a whole sheet of it. It would be $500 for that much moon gel at Guitar Center, I think. And it comes in pretty colors and snakes. That deadens the sound of the drums if they're getting a little ringy. Elliot wanted the song that we're working on to have sort of a dead, sort of modern, retro sound. There's a room mic setup. Again, I'm using an SM57. That's opposite the room from the drum kit, and it's an SM57 just pointing right at the wood wall. I find that when in a smaller room, like the live room we used the other day, if I point the microphone sort of directly at the wall, I can get a bigger room sound. I think that the sound of the drums is sort of reflecting off the wall and then back into the microphone as opposed to the microphone just picking up the direct sound of the drums. Then when I compress it, it starts to sound big. A big problem that people have when recording at home or in a barn or in a guest house somewhere is isolation. They don't necessarily have booths. So quite often I use Waves GTR, where we can plug the guitar directly into the Pro Tools system, and then if we want to, we can reamp it later. A lot of times the guys hear the sound that we're getting out of GTR and basically we just keep it. But certainly for a tracking date where we don't want a big guitar amp in the same room with the drums and with the singer, using GTR makes a lot of sense. Same with the bass guitar. And then the one room that I would desperately try to find a place to put someone outside of the space with the drums is the singer, maybe a closet, maybe a bathroom, maybe down the hall. The singer is where I'd like to not have their microphone pick up the drums as well. So let me see. Let me get back to my session. That said, I think what I'll do is I'll play the song in for you now. This is a track Elliot has been working on a record, and basically we just did a little pre-production for one song. It's sort of a verse and a B section and a chorus. It's about 2 minutes long. Let me play this for you, and then I'll take us into the session and show you what's going on. But basically the rule was it's a make-believe band, only 8 inputs. It's the Recorder Man drum setup plus a kick and a snare. And then the guitars were recorded, or the basic track guitar was recorded into GTR, and there is an overdub or two that came on later. All right, here's our track. There we go. That's our Waves webinar song. Actually, I think it's due to be another song that he's working on, but we use that part as our indie band on a budget demo. So let's take a look at some of the stuff up close in this session here. I'll go to the screen view. The first thing I'm going to show you is, let me talk a little bit about how I set this session up. In lieu of having a real recording console in front of me, I like to make a make-believe recording console in my Pro Tools session. So for that, after I make the tracks for each of the 8 microphones, I'm going to open up a R channel on each track, which basically gives me EQ and compression and a gate. It's kind of like the knobs of my console. It makes me happy, right? I have to take into consideration not choosing plugins that are going to have too much delay associated with them and create problems with latency into the headphones, right? So an R channel on every single channel is a relatively low latency plugin, plus the same one across the board eliminates there being phase issues. Same sort of thought process goes into doing something for the master fader. And for that, I use the L3LL. And I can't grab it because it's just out of range. But the L3LL is the low latency multiband. Here, now it will let me open it. There it is. The low latency multiband compressor. This sort of keeps everything at CD volume and lets it pump and sound a little bit more real. I'll show you how much it's working or not working. Basically a teeny little bit of reduction around the low mids. Also the separation is reduced from 100% to, in this session, 84. So instead of it being this discrete 4-band thing, it sort of glues the bands together a little bit. And you're really going to see it kick in during the loud part. So with this, I'm adding a little bit of low and sucking out a little bit of low mid. So the L3LL is something that I can actually have on the master fader while we're tracking, and I appreciate the low latency that it offers for that. You can see that the reference guitar, which was the main guitar for the song, is this part. He's playing that through the GTR plugin using the Creme Amplifier. More on that later. The Creme Amplifier and the cabinet that's chosen happens to be the cabinet that belongs with that amplifier, and the microphone selection happens to be the way I mic up that amplifier here. I do have a picture of that. Let me show that to you. There it is. So here's a little secret sort of let out of the bag for you. The Creme Amplifier is this sort of old American 60s vintage combo amp, which I adore. It's got 112 speaker, and the Denenberg setup, as it's called there in the mic selection, are 257s placed like that, and just panned mono. So they're kind of like 257s making one big 57 on steroids, as Paul Reed Smith always calls everything something on steroids. So that Creme Amplifier is one of my favorites. Quite often we have to spend a little bit of time if we're working with a guitar player who has his favorite vintage amplifier, and then we tell him, well, look, let's not use that amplifier. Would you mind just playing through this plugin? You do get looked at like you're out of your mind, and it takes a little bit of a sales pitch to get them to go along with that. The sales pitch often is, listen, if you don't like the tone we get, we can always reamp this later. So what does that mean? That means we give him something in his headphones that he likes, that he can play with, and if need be, after the tracking is done, we can run that direct signal back through a reamp box, which takes the direct signal out of Pro Tools and sends it back into a guitar amp. Something that's important when we're tracking with the GTR is that the guitar see the right load or the right impedance input, and so the direct box that comes with GTR, the PRS Waves DI, makes the guitar happy, and it sounds correct. Sometimes I'll track guitar through this direct box, back out through Pro Tools into a real amp, and mix and match real amplifiers and GTR sounds. So now that the cat's been let out of the bag and I've told you what that basic guitar was, I actually have 2 tracks in this session now. I have the reference guitar track, which, here, let me show you the session. The reference guitar track, which is the direct signal into an H delay, which is a nice vintage sounding delay, and then into the GTR Creme model. And then directly below this now in the session, although it wasn't on when I played the song for you, I have the reamp of that direct guitar sent back through the actual amplifier and recorded on a stereo track with the 2 mics panned center. So I can actually sit here and play this song for you and go back and forth between the model and the real amplifier. So let's see how close we got. Starting out with, that's the GTR version. pretty close. It's very close. When we worked on that product originally, it blew my mind when I heard the model of that amplifier. Here's the loud part, same comparison. That's the Preamp. Here's GTR. Preamp. GTR. Anyway, I keep switching back and forth. It's pretty remarkable. Quite often when the guitar player hears that, he says, just leave it. I'm fine with that. So that tool for working on a project where everyone is in the same room, because we have something like GTR, that's like having an ISO booth for a guitar amp. It's like having an ISO booth for a bass amp. The bass models are wonderful. I'm very fond of the Motown one. I use that quite often. Quite often, I much prefer that to a real microphone on my real Motownish bass amp. So what else is going on in this session? Let me play you the drums. I didn't do the recorder man yet. I'm going kind of out of sequence. Here are just the two microphones over the drum set. I should show you that picture one more time, right? Where is it? Okay, you remember the two microphones measured by string so that the exact same distance from the bass drum and the snare drum. Phase coherent, right? Here is that sound, just those two mics. Now the pan is not hard left and right. They're tucked in a little bit. It's like it's 68, 68. I do have the R channel on here. It's boosting a teeny little bit of 85 or so, and it's pulling out a little bit at 220, and it's compressing a little bit. If I bypass this, here's the microphone's absolutely ruler flat. And then here's with the R channel turned on. Hyping it just a little bit. But it's pretty remarkable. That's a real drum sound with two microphones. Joe was telling me he's been setting it up with one mic in a little bit different place. Depending on which YouTube video you look at, you're going to find different people put these mics in different places. The best thing is to experiment. We first put up a different set of microphones and felt like we were getting too much hi-hat, and for some reason the 414 was happening the other day. Let me zoom back out. So we added to that the room mic, which I showed you. Remember the 57 was all the way pointing at the opposite wall, pointing straight at the wood. That microphone is has a little bit of R bass on it, which is adding some low end. I'll bypass that so you can hear the difference. This is just the room mic, man. Add our bass. And then another trick, which we use a lot to get some of the hi-hat out of this microphone. In addition to pointing the microphone away from the drums at the wood, I use a de-esser. I'll bypass this. Back on. So that helps. And mind you, it's not doing a great deal. It's just doing a little bit. So when you add all those microphones together, and remember it's just 4, we have a 57 on the kick drum. I haven't showed you that. That also has the R channel with quite a bit of scoop for 200. Here's what that 57 on the kick sounds like. Bypassed. Also an R bass on the close mic of the kick. Here's bypassed. And then turn back on. And then there's also a 57 on the snare drum. This has a lot of lows taken out, a lot of high pass going on. just making it snappier. Those 4 microphones, the 257s up close, and then the recorder man sound like this. Then when we hit the loud part of the song, that's where I turn the room mic on, and we get this. So this is the 5 microphones as recorded. Here's the room mic off. Back on. So there's one other trick going on in here which I have to fess up to, and that is that when we hit the loud part of the song, I did take the snare drum and throw another track on it, and I'm mixing in a sort of snare ring sample, and I'm running it through a guitar amp so I can get this sort of sound. Which is my favorite sort of crazy, like bombastic Soundgarden sound. But Elliot wouldn't let me take the moon gel off his drums the other day, so I had to sort of sneak that in there on the loud part. But here's now that guitar amped snare drum along with all the other mics. And then again, the quiet part, where the room sound isn't in there and the snare amp isn't in there, sounds like this. So that's just 4 microphones, 2 of them 57s, and then the other 2, I suppose, are the only sort of expensive mics in the setup, which are those 414 condenser mics. I'll tell you that at home, we have even better luck with these cheap Shure condensers, old ones that have like an on-off switch on them, but we love the way they sound for Recorder Man, more so than a fancy microphone. What else is going on in this session? The bass was played direct. Not a lot to say. Something that I would encourage people to think about when they're recording is that if they don't know what a knob does, perhaps don't turn it. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people feel the need to EQ madly, like with like boosts and cuts and find specific frequencies and third harmonics. I tend to not do that. I think that if I were to give a young engineer a tool, I would give him a high-pass filter and say that's all you need. Then perhaps that little bit of EQ on the master fader. The bass is just recorded direct. Nothing was done to it at all during the verses. And then when we hit the loud part of the song, you'll see that it changes to another track here. That's the blue waveform. And that is running through another GTR model called Overbass into an 810 cabinet and a ribbon mic model. And that gives us the sort of teethy, distorted bass for that part. I seem to have the kick drum solo. I'll bypass this. Back on. A little fuzz, a little focus, a little snarl goes a long way. So we're going to forget about the reamp and just stick with the model of the Creme Amp, the guitar player having been talked into the fact that it sounds the same, and it in fact does. So the reference guitar was the first thing that happened. If I had, 4 sons named Elliot, we would have recorded this live into the 8 inputs, but I had to have him take turns playing each of these instruments. As mentioned before, now that he's grown up, my son and I work on a lot of projects together. We're in the middle of a record we're in the middle of a couple of records, actually. And he ends up playing drums and guitars and bass and whatever's necessary. So he did one thing at a time here. The first thing that happened was this scratch guitar done to a click. It is a nice PRS McCarty played into the GTR Creme model. And that's kind of what the whole song is based on. That amp sounds pretty good in the loud part too. So then there's some other neat things going on in this track. There are some tracks down below here that are named Jerry, for instance. One of our favorite guitar players who we'll call to come play on a record is Jerry Leonard, who I believe is also a Waves artist. Jerry has played with David Bowie and with Suzanne Vega. He was one of the very early adopters of sort of loop pedal, ambient, Eno-sounding stuff. And he always comes in for a session and plays that part that you had to have, but you didn't know what it was until he played it. And so when we name a track Jerry, it's usually that sort of ambient, sort of beautiful sounding guitar. We have a couple of Jerry tracks in here, quote unquote. One is labeled Guitar B3, and that is the guitar tool rack preset called Leslie Guitar. What is it? A couple of amplifiers into, oh my God, a lot of pedals. I'll play you what the sound is. A very stereo B3 sound. And it ends up sounding like an organ in the context of the song. So that's kind of a normalish Jerry sound. A little bit more out is this track labeled Fairies, because it sounds like fairies. And I'll play you the sound first and then explain. I'm going to turn it up so you can hear it. So what that is the reference guitar sent out a bus to another aux input, and then on that aux input is the Lady GTR stomp pedal into the spring reverb stomp pedal, but the pitch is set to an octave up. So when we blend that in with the original guitar, it sounds like little fairies dancing around in the background. Kind of like a keyboard sound, but without using a keyboard, right? There's one other guitar sound in here, which I'll show you in solo, also called Jerry. Guitar amp punchy into a pedal board with a Lady echo set to reverse. And what that is a sustainer guitar, like an EBO, just into some nice echoes and a medium amplifier. That's the only thing I played actually on the session. You could tell it's a little not cleanly played, but in the soup, it takes the place of strings. I'll turn it up. Actually turned down in the mix to like, oh, it didn't have automation. I better put it back. There we go. Okay. So it's Recorder Man drums plus a kick and snare 57, bass direct. Then there are some overdubs which would have happened after the tracking, which are just sort of heavier guitars and lead bit. I'll play it down one more time now that you've had a tour of what's going on in this session. you have it. That's our webinar song made by myself and my son Elliot. Actually, mostly Elliot. I was pretty happy with how that sounds. There was nothing to rescue. There was just the usual tricks of the sort of snare amp thing in the loud part and making a little bit more fierce where the loud section came in. Something that I forgot to talk about when I was talking about setting up the session is how important it is for a band to be able to play to a click. Quite often, musicians who haven't spent a lot of time playing with a click feel like it limits them or restricts them or makes them uncomfortable. If you can convince people to play with a click or manage to record people who play to a click, the fact is that it frees up such an unbelievable use of all the rest of the technology that is really worth the trouble. If people can play to a click, if a band is able to track to a click, then we can keep every single take. If we did manage to set the vocalist up in a closet or in a bathroom, then the lead vocal from take 1 could be cut and paste onto take 3. The guitar solo from take 2 can go on take 5. The good drum fills from the first take can be put on the solider take for the rest of the song, take 5 or something like that. And so working to a click and staying organized and keeping track on a little yellow pad of where the good takes are, it in fact can result in getting a more natural sounding performance out of an artist than if you just had one take of a song and tried to make them punch in all of their little mistakes. A lot of people, when you're trying to fix their mistakes, they get flustered and they don't play the same way that they would have played when they were tracking with the band. So working to a click, always starting on bar 4, for instance, and doing playlist layers in Pro Tools is definitely a process that I would recommend for tracking indie music. I can see we've got 10 or 15 minutes left. I suppose now would be a fine time to start taking questions. I know I'm supposed to look over here at this computer here and see if anyone has any. I'd take my headphones off for a second. And if everybody really behaves themselves, I will attempt to sing the Waves webinar song as a finale, just to torture Joe and Elliot, because I threatened to do that, because the only thing we didn't show you was the vocal mic. So I'm going to look over here and see if we have any questions. Okay, so Brian asks, how do you feel about using the L1 Ultra Maximizer and a Waves S1 stereo imager on the master fader to add depth and width to your mix? Thank you for your input. Thanks, Brian. Well, I've definitely taken to using the L3 sort of multiband limiter on the master fader in place of the L1, but certainly the S1 stereo imager or the S1 shuffler, here, let's open up one and show one, is something that I use quite often on the master fader. Sometimes right at the end of a mix, I will, I'm trying to find the plugin while I'm talking, so I'm talking slow. Right at the end of a mix, I will see what happens if I open up the S1 and just sort of spread things out a little bit. Why can't I find it? Here it is. Here it is on the screen. So you're talking about this plugin, the S1 Shuffler. So I'll throw this on the master fader, usually before the compression, and maybe push the width out like 1.2 or 1.3. Seems like the farther that I spread it out, the more I need to make up a little bit of the low end with the bass trim adjustment. So sometimes pushing the guitars out a little bit with that is a really handy thing. I should talk about the plugin that I'm using on the master fader here that I didn't show you yet actually for this track. My signal path quite often lately has been first hitting the MPX sort of tape saturation model, and I'll actually use a little bit of slap delay from this. I really dig it. And to depending on how hard we're hitting the needles, this sort of bass drum and the bass guitar will glue together, and then if I keep hitting them harder and harder, then they start to go away a little bit. I find that sort of happy spot. So I quite often will use this Kramer saturation plugin into the L3LL, as I talked about before, instead of the L1. But the stereo shuffler is also something I use quite often for mastering. Quite fond of it. Okay. Next question, comment from Austin. Can you recommend any less expensive mics besides the 414 for the Recorder Man setup? Yeah, I felt kind of bad when I pulled those out of the closet because there are so many unbelievably reasonably priced microphones at this point. Even the MXL 990s we have in our mic closet here. Everything from a C12 to U87s to, Blue AKG microphones. And my partner Rory will quite often choose the MXL 990 over anything for voice recording. Those are great microphones. MXL makes, I guess, the most reasonably priced condenser microphones. Blue makes some nice inexpensive ones. Shure is making some reasonably priced condenser mics. And then AKG has a cheaper version of the 414, right? The 214.
Also the C3000Bs.
And the
same capsule.
And the C3000 is the same capsule?
B.
I'm told that the C3000B is the same capsule by Joe. All my students are extreme tech nuts. They keep track of this stuff better than I do. Let's see. Justin, which Waves EQ would be a good choice for fixing a problematic DI'd bass part that has way too much low-end energy but lacks punch? Well, that's a cool question. The new HEQ is really awesome. I want to pick this view. If we look at the bass in this session, the fun thing about the HEQ is that not only is it an EQ, but it's also an analyzer. Let me open that up on the bass channel on this song. So when I play the bass part, you can actually see. Let's say that this area right around here was a problem for you. You can actually play the piano keyboard to move the frequency center for this parametric EQ. And then, having identified your problem frequency, you could pull it out a little bit. Except that it's not set to shelving. Let's see. There we go. And then, depending on which EQ model we choose, like US or UK or digital, we get different bandwidth curves associated with those. So the HEQ is really cool for that. I've also been, in this EQ, enjoying some of the presets that come with it for mastering. Like the Big Booty one is pretty awesome. I won't put it on this song right now. But when I'm trying to go for some extreme sort of electro, house dance mix kind of stuff, I have been going to that on my master fader as part of kind of mixing and mastering at the same time. Adiel wrote, did you compress on the way in? No. That recording was, the idea behind it was that we were recording into a regular I/O that would have no EQ and no compression whatsoever. So the demo song for today was tracked absolutely flat. The only EQ or compression came from the R channel stuff in the Pro Tools session. And I really don't compress on the way in anymore, period, in general, even when I have everything at my disposal. I do EQ the drums on the way in. I record through a little Neve Melbourne console, which I really like. And so I will EQ the kick drum and the snare drum on the way in, and the tom-toms. But everything else that I'm recording pretty much for a record project, whether it be vocals or guitars, I'm recording flat. Nothing makes me happier than to get a real guitar sound or a real vocalist in front of a microphone and have it recorded flat into a session and then not EQ it during the mix either and have the rest of the song just sort of fit around them. You know, they sound like what they should sound like if we're doing a good job. If we put the microphone in the right place, hopefully we don't have to fix it later in the session. Next question. What is the advantage of using the R channel? This is from Jim. Over the other modeled Waves channel strips. Well, I think it's just being a creature of habit that had me using those R channel ones. I definitely am on purpose not choosing the plugins that might have a little bit more latency or delay. Obviously, something like a linear multiband EQ is one of my favorite multiband EQs. That's the linear phase multiband mastering EQ. But there's so much delay associated with that plugin that there's no way I could use it during a tracking session. So I'm opting just for like a simple console setup with those R channels. I think that when I go back and actually finish a mix, I might, on a guitar, for instance, go to one of the VEQs and try something that has a little bit more of a vintage vibe to get that sound out of it. I do like to use, less rather than more. I find myself, for vocal setups, quite often using the CLA vocal artist model plugins, signature plugins. That's really a go-to plugin for me. And then definitely some of that Eddie Kramer stuff on the Master Fader. I get a big kick out of that. Giles wrote, in what circumstance would you use vocal or bass rider plugins? Boy, the bass rider plugin really surprised me. We were setting up a sort of electronic kind of techno track, and I was amazed at how accurately and how quickly it just made the bass sit in one place. Most everyone understands that low end is one of the toughest things to hear properly in a control room situation. A lot of times there's frequencies in our bedroom or a dorm room or a control room for that matter where like we might hear 80 hertz really, really well, but 60 hertz, it just isn't there in our seating position. And then you could move 3 feet over to the right and all of a sudden we don't hear 80 anymore and we hear 50 really loud because of the standing waves, because of the acoustics in the space. So sometimes some bass notes will sort of stick out and some will go away. And I find myself having to look at the meters to decide whether the problem is in this room or in my mix. And so the bass rider is kind of a new tool for me where I find that the judicious use of that sort of takes away some of the guesswork out of trying to figure out whether the low end is in the room or in my mix. So I use that. I also, I'll use the vocal rider in front of a limiter or a compressor on a vocal so that when the singer sings really, really loud, it isn't just smashing that compressor down. It's sort of like the fader ride that I would have done on the console when tracking it in the old days. So Bob wrote, do you like to record acoustic guitar as a stereo track or mono track? And what type of plugin do you like to use on acoustic guitar? Well, acoustic guitar, my favorite way to record it is with a mid-side miking technique. That's a great, just if you Google, the wiki for mid-side miking, that's like a condenser mic pointed where you normally would point it, sort of at the sound hole, but sideways, or right kind of like at the last fret, actually, not at the sound hole. But then we add to that a figure 8 mic, usually a ribbon mic, and a fathead is fine. So that's a figure 8 mic with picking up the sound from either side, and that's lined up with the two diaphragms or elements right next to each other. And the figure 8 mic has its mono audio split to a hard left and hard right channel. So we're taking 3 channels of the console. One of those channels is phase flipped. I know this is confusing. But what we end up with is when you add the center channel to the phase flipped figure 8 ribbon mic, you end up with this beautiful stereo acoustic guitar sound that sounds very real and very organic, and it's also 100% mono compatible. I can't recommend it highly enough. It sounds just wonderful. It's great for percussion instruments too, if you can afford the tracks. There is a mid-side decoding plugin it came in one of my Waves bundles, which is really cool, where I can just put those two microphones, the condenser and the figure 8, into a stereo channel, and I just throw that Waves MS decoder in there, and it does all the phase flip trickery for me. All I do is adjust the level on the way into it to get my mid-side sound. The plugin that I might put on that acoustic guitar, if the strings were dead, let's say, would be probably the Aphex, the model of the Aphex exciter. I have a, sometimes it's like the bomb and I love that thing, and then sometimes it just doesn't like the track I'm putting it on. It's funny, but I would try it for sure. Jay asks, do you have any tips or general rules regarding EQing the kick and bass guitar to get them to sit well together in the mix? Boy, that's one of those ones where I see people trying all kinds of crazy stuff, like keying one with the other, or making it so every time the bass drum hits, the bass guitar ducks. I don't really get involved with that. I try and make them be sounds that are going to get along well with each other. Obviously, if the parts that are being played don't make sense, then perhaps we'll start playing with some trickery where the bass drum makes the bass turn down a little bit, so they're not both playing at full volume at the same time, but not a 100% gate or duck by any means. For electronic music and R&B music, the trick that's quite often used is that the entire mix goes through an aux fader with a compressor that is being keyed by the bass drum, so that every time the bass drum hits, the whole mix turns down a little bit. That's how you get that massive sounding bass drum when you're mixing that type of music. So that's a trick I'll use if I need the kick drum to sound devastating, Yeah. And sometimes for more conventional rock music, that trick kind of pays off too. Reed. So comment from Reed. Do you ever use the SSL or API channel strips plugins? Do you think they're even close to the real deal? I think they're really close to the real deal. In fact, I remember when they were working on the SSL product, they had a hardware sort of reference channel strip that they got from SSL, and they did null tests. That's where the same signal goes through the hardware channel and through a software model of it, and they flip the phase on them and null them to mono, and the more the signal cancels, and in this case it just about 100% cancels, the more that sort of proves that they're the same sound. Now that said, I was never a fan of SSL consoles, and so therefore I have the equal dislike for the perfectly modeled SSL plugins, quite honestly. I know the guys at Waves are going to kill me for saying that. I am a Neve guy and an API guy. I use the Neve models and the API models all the times. The API 2500 compressor I'll use on the master fader sometimes in the middle of my chain. At school, we bought one of those API 1608 consoles, and so we're able to sit there and compare the models of the EQs with the real EQs. And I think that they compare very favorably. I'm a big fan of the 10-band graphic API EQs. I think those are the 560s. I love the way you could jam your thumb into them and sort of shape the EQ like clay. Something that a lot of people don't realize is that those are variable bandwidth. So if you just push one of those little 10-band EQ faders a teeny little bit, it's a broad band or a wide boost. And then the farther you press it, the tighter the Q gets, or the tighter the bandwidth gets. And that's a really easy sort of musical, boob-proof EQ. I like that one. So Federico said, how do you go about processing the vocal track? Thanks. Well, that really depends on who's singing and how they're singing. And that's a perfect question, because as we're starting to run out of time, I should talk about the vocal chain. If we're doing rock music, We don't necessarily want to record a rock singer like a Steven Tyler of Aerosmith or something, the same way we would record an opera singer or a classically trained singer. We don't need a great big microphone set up 3 feet away from them with them sort of standing there and delivering the song. We want to hear all of the sort of violence and the closeness of their performance. Let me switch microphones. So like I have a vocal mic plugged in this session that we're working on. And I'll switch to that. Hello? I trust you can still hear me. So it sounds a little bit different. That's because I'm running through an R channel. I've actually, to make the singer sound young, sometimes I take a lot of low end out. You can see that I have this microphone high pass filtered at 370. If I bypass that, now you get the full range of my voice. You can tell that I'm an old guy, right? But if I put that high pass filter back on, all of a sudden I sound young and handsome. There's also a lot of, well, not a lot, but a little bit of high end boost on this channel. That's because I'm just talking into a garden variety SM58. Also in the vocal path for me is a de-esser to remove some of the sibilants, although I don't have it cutting me too hard. Live, for tracking, I would use this sort of thing. Again, it's the R channel. I did add the de-esser plugin. When mixing, I definitely end up adding a little bit more like perhaps a aux send into a guitar amp, into an echo to give me sort of a Hendrixy, echoey kind of guitar sound, vocal sound, I mean. And then also, I perhaps would put a guitar amp on me, and that totally changes my vibe, doesn't it? So this song that we're working on, it doesn't have any vocals yet. There are no words to it yet. However, I did threaten my son that I was going to sing this just to terrorize him, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to turn the reverb on, and then we'll talk about vocal sounds, and I'll record a vocal for you as our last thing here. Oh, I don't have my webinar screen. All right. I'm more afraid than you are. To the Waves webinar. I'm singing a vocal, kinda like Leonard Cohen. You can hear how the high pass filter helps me cut through the mix for you. Let's see the de-esser do its job in the pre-chorus for us. I have no words, it's a Waves webinar. For verse 2, I'll sing into a guitar amp for you. It's quite a different vibe. You can hear how it cuts through the sound. Without it, I'm quite normal, but with it, I'm quite vibey. Oh yes, it's a Waves webinar for you. I'm singing live and I'm making up the words. Oh God, here comes the loud part. It's a Waves webinar. The guitar amp helps me sing right through the loud guitars. Oh God, my son's gonna kill me. I think I'll scream. I'll scream at the TV screen. I can still hear myself. It's quite embarrassing. We're in the loud part of the Waves webinar. And I leave the guitar amp on for the end. It sounds kind of neato. was about as embarrassing as it can get, really, at a Waves webinar. However, although it was me singing, I thought that the tone that I had dialed up on the Pro Tools system fit the track. I don't know whether I like the amped vocal better than the sort of Leonard Cohen-y up-close vocal, but all of them were just an SM58. And so that would be the channel 8 input, or the last track of our song. Again, the topic being recording on a budget, so we limited ourselves to 8 inputs. We had the 5 inputs, which was quite luxurious for the drum set. The recorder man setup, kick and snare and room mic, bass direct, guitar direct, and then with the option of reamping, and a vocal plugged right into track 8. So it's a pleasure doing these for Waves. I'm curious if anyone is even tuned in anymore after that song. Let me know. I hope you enjoyed this, and everybody have a great holiday season.
All right, that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you, Peter, and thank you all for taking part. Have a great day, and we hope to see you at the next one.